embajador Cho Jae-moon, embajador de la República de Corea en Guatemala, distinguido señor Chan Won-yoon, primer secretario de la República de Corea en Guatemala, estimado señor discutores y de crimen de la Policía Nacional de Corea del Sur, distinguido señor Hernán Miguel Morales, decano de la Facultad de Ciencias de la Facultad de Arquitectura, y estimada magíster Lourdes Platón, directora de CIAC, como también autoridades académicas presentes, funcionarios de gobierno, cuerpo diplomático, profesores, estudiantes, amigos en general. La Universidad Rafael Andino, a través del Centro de Investigaciones Asia-Pacífico CIAC, les damos la más cordial bienvenida a la conferencia China vs. United States Influence over South Korea. Para el CIAC es un placer servir como ente de referencia sobre los estudios coreanos, realizando actividades en forma conjunta con aliados a nivel internacional. En esta ocasión agradecemos también el apoyo y disponibilidad del profesor Duncan en llevar a cabo esta conferencia virtual. Asimismo, agradecemos el auspicio de Korea Foundation para realizar las conferencias sobre estudios coreanos. Por lo tanto, le doy la palabra a nuestra subdirectora de CIAC, la magíster Lourdes Platón.
Buenos días a todos y a todas, autoridades académicas, señor embajador, cuerpo diplomático, profesores, estudiantes, amigos de mí. Tal y como lo dijo Annalisa, para el Centro de Investigaciones de Asia-Pacífico, esta actividad es muy importante, particularmente con el doctor Duncan, que es el director del Centro de Estudios Coreanos de la Universidad de California de China. Esta conferencia es la primera actividad académica que se deriva del proyecto Korea Foundation con la Universidad Académica. Yo quisiera solamente puntualizar algunos elementos que nos parecen importantes entre la relación entre China y Estados Unidos y, por supuesto, Corea del Sur. La relación entre China y Estados Unidos efectivamente ha estado marcada por la cooperación, el conflicto y la desconfianza. La cooperación ha sido evidente en reiteradas ocasiones. Y podría mencionar por lo menos un ejemplo, que es cuando se ratificó el 1 de junio del 2013 la intención de mantener una sólida alianza para impedir y contener las potenciales amenazas y provocaciones de Corea del Norte en su programa nuclear. No solo para la protección de los Estados Unidos y China, sino para los países del sudeste asiático, especialmente Corea del Sur. En ese sentido, China ha reiterado que el respeto por los intereses del otro es la clave de las relaciones entre China y Estados Unidos, aunque mantiene ciertas diferencias en cuanto a algunos temas, por ejemplo el tema de los derechos humanos. Es interesante cómo los líderes chinos creen que China representa el futuro no solo en lo referente a lo militar, sino también en la economía, la cultura local. De hecho, los líderes chinos creen que el destino de China es recuperar su protagonismo, sino la preeminencia en la región y tal vez con el tiempo en el mundo entero, a través de su política exterior del acceso pacífico, lo cual no deja de poner un pie a Estados Unidos. Las desconfianzas, por otro lado, en este sentido hay muchas, pero una de las que más preocupa a los Estados Unidos es la seguridad cibernética, especialmente por el ciberespionaje y el programa nuclear iraní, así como lo relacionado con la cooperación en la cuenca del Pacífico. Y finalmente, por algunos expertos creen que ha llegado el momento de inflexión entre las relaciones entre China y Estados Unidos, y esto podría derivar en varios conflictos. Conflictos marcados al menos por el conflicto entre China y Japón, por las disputas de las islas de Duncan, mientras la tensión continua de Estados Unidos sigue firmando que las islas se administran por Japón, lo que significa que entran bajo el abrigo protector de la tradición de Estados Unidos y Japón. Esto hace que la tensión se vuelva más fuerte. Por otro lado, el mar de China meridional sigue representando una herida abierta para las relaciones entre Estados Unidos y China. Existe la posibilidad de un enfrentamiento que podría provocar una crisis mayor en la que Estados Unidos se sentiría obligado a intervenir, especialmente si Filipinas, aliado a Estados Unidos, interviene. Otros dos aspectos, incidentes en el mar. Hace algún tiempo hubo un problema de casi se accidenta un buque con unos marinos de Estados Unidos y casi se da un conflicto en ese sentido. Hubo un incidente en el aire. Y finalmente, un cambio en el liderazgo de Taiwán que endurezca las armoniosas relaciones entre Taiwán y la República Popular de China. Sin más que agregar que estas han sido algunas de las reflexiones de los analistas e investigadores del Centro de Investigaciones de Asia-Pacífico, le damos paso a la conferencia del Dr. Duncan, quien es licenciado en Historia por la Universidad de Corea, tiene una maestría en Historia por la Universidad de Hawái y tiene un doctorado en Historia por la Universidad de Washington. Tiene una larga trayectoria como profesor y como administrativo y cuenta con amplias publicaciones de libros y artículos. Sin más, le damos la bienvenida al doctor Duncan.
Can you hear me, Professor Duncan?
Yes, not very loud, but I hear you faintly.
Okay, thank you. Please proceed with your presentation, please.
Okay. Buenos días. Porque no puedo hablar español, tengo que hablar en inglés, lo siento. I have been asked to talk about Korea between China and the United States today. I'm not an international relations specialist. I'm not a political scientist. I am an historian. And so I think the best I can do for you is to give you historical perspectives on contemporary international relations in Northeast Asia, focusing on Korea between China and the United States. There are, in my point of view, three things that we need to keep in mind when we think about relations between Korea and China and Korea and the United States. Number one is the question of economic interests versus security concerns. Number two, history and geopolitics. And number three, the fact that Northeast Asia is a tough neighborhood. There are a lot of powerful countries there, and there is rising nationalism throughout the area. The approach I will take today will be first to give a brief overview of the current status and issues, then do a brief historical survey with the question in mind, what can history tell us? We will look at the modern geopolitical shift, a shift from shared concern between China and Korea about inner Asia to Northeast Asia as an arena of conflict between continental and maritime powers. Then I will talk a bit about what I think are some significant variables that may play an important role in shaping relations between Korea and the U.S. and Korea and China. And then I will conclude with a few final remarks. Can you hear me okay? I hope so. Okay, let's begin with an overview of current status and issues. We talk first about the relationship between South Korea and the United States. We have to consider how South Korea sees this. Vast majority of Koreans believe that the United States is needed to help protect against threats from North Korea. And also many South Koreans value the United States as a balance against Chinese power in the region. From the United States perspective, U.S. forces are nominally in South Korea to deter North Korea. But increasingly, South Korea is being seen by Americans as an important base for containing China and perhaps even Russia. And the United States considers South Korea as an important factor in keeping Japan in the United States camp. So far, so good? Now, what about South Korea and China? From the South Korean perspective, the diplomatic ties were opened in 1991, but there is no alliance between China and Korea. Economic relations between China and South Korea are increasingly important. The volume of trade between those two countries far exceeds the volume of trade between the United States and South Korea today. So for the people of South Korea, their economic ties with China are very important. But Koreans are worried about Chinese ambitions. From the Chinese perspective, South Korea is, of course, an important trading partner. But also, China tends to regard Korea as having traditionally, historically been within the Chinese sphere of influence. And, as we'll talk about in the historical review, Chinese regard Korea as extremely important for Chinese national security. Let's look at the history. For well over 1,000 years, China and Korea maintained close and usually friendly relations. There was considerable conflict between states in China and states in Korea in the early centuries. But from the 7th century on, relations between China and Korea were generally peaceful. From the 7th to the 10th centuries, Chinese dynasty of Han and the Korean kingdom of UCLA made an alliance, first of all, to deal with a Korean kingdom called Goguryeo, which was located in the northern part of Korea and in Manchuria. And once Han and UCLA had disposed of Goguryeo, then they came back together in an alliance against a new state in Manchuria known as Parhe, or Bohai in Chinese. Han and UCLA both fell in the early 10th century. But in China, the Tang was replaced in the mid-10th century by the Song dynasty. And in Korea, Goguryeo replaced UCLA. And the Song and Goguryeo shared interests in containing kingdoms in the Manchuria area, first the Liao and then later the Jin. During the 13th and 14th centuries, both China and Korea were part of the great Mongol Empire. But after the collapse of the Mongols in the second half of the 14th century, then there were new dynasties set up in both China and Korea, the Ming in China and the Joseon in Korea. And the Ming and the Joseon both shared interests in containing some people known as the Jurchens, who lived in Manchuria. So these long centuries of peaceful relations, cooperative relations between China and Korea were dressed up, that is, they were presented as tributary relations in which Korean kings recognized Chinese emperors as their ritual suzerains. But the underlying basis of these enduring peaceful relations between China and Korea was their shared interest in containing Manchuria. If you look at this map of East Asia, you will see, of course, China is over here, Korea is here, and this area up in here, which is now China's Dongbei region, is Manchuria. It's Manchuria where Goguryeo was located, where Pare was located, where the Liao dynasty was located, where the Jin was located, where the Jurchens lived. Both China and Korea felt threatened by the rise of possible powerful states in this region, and thus China and Korea worked together to try to contain this area and keep it from presenting a threat to either country. Things changed in the late 16th and early 17th centuries. First thing that happened was the invasion of Korea by Japan in the late 16th century. So, under the leadership of Toyotomi Hideyoshi, forces from Japan invaded Korea on their way to try to conquer China. At that time, China came to Korea's aid, and the combined forces of China and Korea eventually were able to expel the Japanese from the Korean peninsula. But then, about 50 years later, some people we know of as the Manchus, that is, people who lived up in this area in Manchuria, they launched expeditions against Korea, and near the middle of the 17th century, they conquered China and established the Qing dynasty. That meant that the area of Manchuria was now under control of the Qing dynasty, based in China. And so the joint concern that Korea and China had about controlling Manchuria faded into the background. What emerged was Russia. In the 17th century, Russians were pushing east. This was their frontier. And this resulted in conflict between China and Russia. And in the middle of in the second half of the 17th century, Qing China and Chosun Korea engaged in a joint campaign against Russian forces up in the northern border regions of China. This was during the years 1654 to 1668. Then things began to change radically in the 19th century. Let's begin by talking about changes in the relations between Korea and China. When Westerners came to East Asia, they forced China to open its ports in about 1841 or 1842. They forced Japan to open its ports in the 1850s, but Korea remained adamant that it would not enter into relations with Western powers. But eventually Korea was forced to open its ports by Japan in the year 1876. The opening of the ports by Japan was followed by considerable domestic unrest in Korea. And that resulted in Chinese sending soldiers to Korea, sending military forces to Korea in 1882. And from 1882 on, for the next 12 years, China began for the first time to actively interfere in Korea, in both Korea's domestic and foreign affairs. So China broke from past tradition of non-interference and began to behave very much like an imperial power, like a colonizer in Korea. In 1894, war broke out in Korea between China and Japan. The Japanese won quick early victories in the war, and by 1895, China had to sue for peace. That meant, of course, that the Chinese were no longer in a position to interfere in Korea. It also meant the end of traditional tributary relations between China and Korea. As you all know, I hope, Korea was colonized by Japan in 1910. This meant that many Korean nationalists, Korean patriots, left Korea and went into China, where they tried to resist Japan. Korean nationalists established an interim government in Shanghai, China in 1920. And that interim government collaborated closely with the Chinese nationalist government of Chiang Kai-shek throughout the 1920s, 1930s, and first half of the 1940s. At the same time, there were a lot of Korean communists also in China. Some of them, led by Kim Il-sung, who eventually became leader of North Korea, waged guerrilla warfare against Japanese forces in Manchuria. Other Korean communists were in the main part of China where they fought alongside Mao Zedong against the Japanese. After Korea was liberated with the end of World War II in 1945, most of those Koreans in China, both the nationalists and the communists, came back to Korea. As you all know, war broke out in Korea in June of 1950. North Korean forces crossed the 38th parallel and swept quickly through the southern half of Korea. At that point, the United Nations, urged by the United States, intervened and eventually pushed the North Koreans out of South Korea and went further north across the 38th parallel to very close to the border with China. At that point, China decided to intervene in the Korean War. And large numbers of Chinese troops came into Korea and pushed the U.S.-led United Nations forces back down into the southern part of Korea. Eventually, a ceasefire was arranged in 1953, which left Korea divided and left South Korea very closely tied to the United States and North Korea closely tied to China. Things began to change in 20th century relations between China and South Korea about the time of the collapse of the communist bloc of the Soviet Union and the Eastern European satellite states. That meant that the world order was changing, and in recognition of that, South Korea and China signed a treaty. They recognized each other diplomatically in 1991. This opening of diplomatic relations was followed by an increase in pro-Chinese sentiment in South Korea. Many people in South Korea began to look upon China favorably, rather than simply looking on China as a hated communist entity. What about relations between Korea and the United States? The history is much shorter than that of relations between Korea and China, but it's still very complex. The first significant encounter between Americans and Koreans came in 1866, when an armed merchant vessel called the General Sherman forced its way up the river towards the city of Pyongyang and provoked an attack by Koreans. The ship was burnt and the crew was killed. The United States eventually found out about that incident, and so in 1871 the United States sent military forces, Marines on ships, to the coast of Korea, where it attacked a Korean fortress on the island of Gwanghwa, killed a few hundred Koreans, issued a bunch of demands, and then after a short time packed up and left. So you can see Korea and the United States did not get off to a good start. Nonetheless, in 1882, Korea entered into a treaty with the United States. Its first treaty with a Western power. This came about at the urging of China. Remember, China had a lot of influence in Korea at this time. China was very much concerned about Russia. Afraid that Russia was going to move into China and into Korea. And so the Chinese urged the Koreans to enter into a treaty with the United States in order to contain Russian expansion in the area. One of the provisions of that treaty was that each party, that is both Korea and the United States, would use their influence to help the other when the other was attacked. When the war broke out in 1894 between Japan and China, the United States did urge both Japan and China to respect Korea's interests. However, 10 years later, when war broke out in 1904 between Russia and Japan, the United States took a different position. By this time, the United States had acquired a colony in Asia, the Philippine Islands, and the United States was very interested in protecting its interests there. And so when in the summer of 1905 it became very clear that Japan was, quite surprisingly, going to defeat Russia in this war, the United States Secretary of State, who was on a tour of East Asia, visited Tokyo, had a meeting with the Japanese Foreign Minister, Katsura, and the two of them entered into a secret agreement which said basically that Japan would recognize U.S. interest in the Philippines, and in return, the U.S. would recognize Japanese interests in Korea. This was a secret memorandum. It was not known to the world until almost 20 years later. But it set the stage for the Japanese takeover of Korea. In 1905, the Japanese forced on Korea a protectorate treaty, a treaty which gave Japan authority over Korea's foreign affairs and defense matters. And 5 years later, Japan abandoned any pretense of benevolence and simply annexed Korea, made it part of the Japanese empire. This could not have happened without U.S. recognition of Japanese interest in Korea. But as you know, eventually the United States and Japan went to war in 1941. The war came to an end in 1945 with the absolute surrender of Japan, and with Japan giving up its foreign territories, including Taiwan, Korea, and the parts of Chinese territory that it had seized. As World War II was drawing to a close, and the Allies, that is the United States, Great Britain, China, and Russia, were growing confident of victory, they began to hold a series of meetings to plan for a post-war order. And Korea was a topic of concern at those meetings. And the Allies eventually agreed that Korea should become independent, but not right away. They agreed that there should be a period of trusteeship or tutelage carried out by the Allies until they felt that Korea was ready to govern itself. World War II in the Pacific came to a rather sudden end after the United States chose to use atomic bombs on Japan. That meant that the Allies were not fully prepared to deal with the situation in Korea. But in August of 1945, at the behest of the United States and Russia agreed that they would share occupation of Korea. That is, Russian forces would accept the surrender of Japanese soldiers north of the 38th parallel, and the United States would accept the surrender of Japanese forces south of the 38th parallel. The idea was that the United States and the Soviet Union would work together with China and Britain to prepare Korea for eventual independence. Unfortunately, because of domestic politics in Korea and because of the onset of the Cold War, the temporary division of Korea became a permanent division. The United States ruled South Korea from 1945 through 1948 in something called the U.S. Army military government in Korea, during which time it prepared the way for a separate government to be established in South Korea. At the same time, the Soviet Union was facilitating the establishment of a separate government in North Korea. Then in 1948, both Soviet and American forces left the Korean Peninsula, with two hostile states facing each other, North Korea and South Korea. As I mentioned before, in June of 1950, North Korea invaded the South. The United States led the United Nations intervention in the Korean War and certainly played a major role in pushing back the North Korean invaders and in holding the Chinese forces to northern Korea. In 1953, a ceasefire was negotiated, but large numbers of American troops remained in South Korea to guard against further aggression from the north. I was one of those United States troops in the late 1960s. I served along the militarized zone in Korea. Even today, there are approximately 20,000 U.S. soldiers in South Korea. That meant the United States has had a great deal of influence on what has happened in South Korea. And the political history of South Korea from the 1950s through the late 1980s was not a very pretty story. You had authoritarian rulers and military dictators. And the United States supported those dictators. In May of 1980, there occurred a major uprising in the southwestern city of Gwangju. The uprising was calling for restoration of democracy, for the end of military rule in South Korea. But that uprising was quashed brutally by the South Korean military. This caused a problem for the United States, because ever since the Korean War, the commander of the United States military forces in Korea also exercises operational control over all other military forces in South Korea, including the South Korean military. So many South Koreans said, wait, the United States is supposed to be here to protect the Korean people. The United States is supposed to be a supporter of democracy. But the United States allowed the South Korean authorities to send military forces into Gwangju to suppress this democratic protest. And thus, many, not all, but many people in South Korea begin to wonder if the United States was really a true friend to Korea. And we saw from the 1980s on the rise of anti-United States sentiment in South Korea. Okay, what lessons can we draw from this history? One is the question of Korean and Chinese security. I mentioned the geopolitical basis for enduring relations between China and Korea, the concern about containing threats from Manchuria. No, Manchuria is not a threat now since it's part of China. But the Chinese are still concerned about being outflanked on the east. That is, they're very concerned about having a hostile power in the Korean Peninsula, be it the United States or somebody else. The other thing that we need to keep in mind is that the 19th century saw a shift in concerns, in security concerns for both China and Korea, away from the inland areas, away from Manchuria, the northern border region, to the ocean. There was a precursor to this in the 1592 Japanese invasions of Korea, but it really became an issue in the second half of the 19th century, when European powers, maritime powers, began to exercise their military might in East Asia and to colonize and force China and Japan to open their doors and to colonize countries like Vietnam, to chew up parts of China as spheres of influence. So what you saw at that time was an awareness on the part of people of East Asia that East Asia was a place of conflict between continental powers, such as China, and maritime powers, such as Great Britain, France, and the United States. And of course, Japan, which definitely emerged as a maritime power in the second half of the 19th century. So when I talk to many people in East Asia today, they view the United States as a maritime threat. We think of the United States as having all of these airplanes and everything else, but ultimately it is still a maritime power. And it is seen as a threat, in some ways, to East Asia. Let's turn to some more recent events. I'd like to talk about the events of 2002 and 2003. You'll recall I mentioned that from the 1980s there was a rise of skepticism about the United States and its intentions in Korea, rise in sort of anti-American feelings. But the year 2002 saw a real sharp rise in anti-U.S. feelings in South Korea. One thing that brought this about was an accident in which U.S. soldiers were driving a military vehicle and killed 2 schoolgirls. Koreans were very unhappy about this. But because of the status of forces agreement between the United States and Korea, the soldiers who were driving that vehicle could not be tried in Korean courts. Instead, they were tried by the U.S. military, and they were given a not guilty verdict. Koreans could not understand how it was possible for people who were driving a military vehicle and ran over 2 girls could get off free. And so there were many candlelight demonstrations, peaceful nighttime demonstrations, expressing kind of anti-American feeling as a result of that incident. And then the Bush administration, the second Bush administration, decided to take a very hard line towards North Korea. This came at a time when the South Korean government was pursuing a policy of trying to relax tensions between North and South Korea. The Bush administration began talking about the possible preemptive military strikes against North Korea to deprive North Koreans of nuclear weapons. Many people in South Korea said, this will bring us war. And so South Koreans were very concerned about the Bush administration's attitude towards North Korea. And the way the Bush administration didn't seem to be concerned about South Korean interests. So those two things together combined to produce an upsurge in anti-American sentiment, anti-U.S. sentiment in South Korea. But the very next year, 2003, we saw an equally sharp rise in anti-Chinese sentiment. In 2002, Koreans were saying, we're really skeptical of the United States. We don't trust the United States. And many Koreans were thinking very nice things about China. But in 2003, China did something that really upset Koreans. What the Chinese did was to claim historical ownership of an ancient Korean kingdom known as Goguryeo. The kingdom was located in the northern part of the Korean Peninsula and in Manchuria. A kingdom which Koreans had always thought to be part of their historical heritage. a kingdom that Koreans were very proud of because of the way in which Goguryeo had successfully beaten off a number of large-scale invasions from China, from Sui and Tang China. In 2003, the Chinese authorities said, Goguryeo is not a Korean kingdom. It's not part of Korean history. It's Galgoli, and it's part of Chinese history. This really offended the Korean people. There were public demonstrations against it. The Korean government went so far as to establish a new research institution called, at that time, the Goguryeo Research Foundation, in order to refute Chinese claims of historical ownership of that ancient kingdom. This also led to considerable tension between the South Korean and the Chinese governments. Tensions that didn't start to subside until about 4 years later, in 2007, when the Chinese stopped publicly claiming that they owned Goguryeo history. At any rate, this, along with a number of other lesser incidents that occurred in the early 2000s, produced mistrust of China among the people of South Korea. And it led, at least indirectly, to a kind of improved view of the United States. The Americans may be kind of bad, but they're not quite as bad as the Chinese. So, the situation in South Korea, among the public and for the government, is complex. And we can ask, what will be more important to South Korea? Will it be economic interests, trade with China, investment in China, or will it be security concerns and its alliance with the United States? Now let's look at some variables, because this is not just about South Korea, China, and the United States. It's about relations with all of the states that have interests in Northeast Asia. We have to think first, of course, about North Korea. Let me say that the world media tends to portray North Korea as very eccentric, almost crazy. Let me assure you, the North Koreans are not crazy. And the North Koreans are getting very unfair treatment in world media. That's not to say that I'm pro-North Korean. I am not. I don't like the regime up there, but they are not crazy. They're very calculating, and what they do for specific purposes. How does China see North Korea? First of all, North Korea provides that buffer zone on its eastern flank that is so important to China. It has been so important to China throughout history. So strategically, the Chinese see North Korea as very important. Economically, trade and investment between China and North Korea is growing rapidly. China is now investing heavily in the North Korean economy. Doing this part, perhaps, to keep North Korea from collapsing. But of course, there are also profit motives, strategic concerns. But the Chinese find North Korea difficult to control. Even though China is its main ally, even though China is its main economic outside source of support, North Koreans are very stubborn, very proud, and they do what they want to do. And China gets very frustrated at times. How does North Korea see things? Well, North Korea feels like it is under serious threat from the United States. North Korea is worried that the United States will invade. And not without reason, since the United States has a history of invading places like Panama, Iraq, Afghanistan, just to name a few recent cases. And that's probably the main reason why North Korea is interested in having nuclear weapons. North Korea looks at China, of course, as a source of support, both economic and diplomatic. But North Korea does not trust China for pretty much the same reasons as South Korea. North Korea was also very concerned about the Korea issue, for example. But for South Korea and the United States, the governments and the media portray North Korea as very dangerous, as very unpredictable. So North Korea becomes very useful for both governments, both the regime in South Korea today and whether it's the Bush or the Obama administrations in the United States. North Korea is a convenient enemy that we need for political purposes. Let's look at the second variable, Japan. The Chinese look at Japan. They're very unhappy about territorial disputes, particularly about the Senkaku or Diaoyutai Islands up in the East China Sea. Those are islands that Japan took over during its imperial expansion at the end of the 19th, beginning of the 20th century. And Japan managed to retain control of those islands after the end of World War II. China says this is not just. These islands belong to China. Japan says, no way, these islands belong to us. So that's a source of major tension between Japan and China. And we don't know what can come out of that. Also, the Chinese have memories of Japanese aggression. They don't only have memories of the 1894-1895 war, but they have more recent memories of Japanese aggression in China when Japan invaded in 1937 and killed a lot of people and perpetuated carried out the massacre in Nanjing. The Chinese remember these, and they are actively concerned about rising nationalism in Japan today under Prime Minister Abe. How do Koreans look at Japan? Of course, Japan and South Korea together are really important parts of U.S. military strategy in East Asia. And Koreans know this. But Korean-Japanese relationship is very complicated. Back in 2002, South Korea and Japan were co-hosts of the World Cup. And that was a kind of high point in Korean-Japanese relations. Things seemed to be going pretty well. So they decided to announce the year 2005 as the year of Korean-Japanese friendship. In the year 2005, I was in Japan as a visiting scholar at a Japanese university, and I couldn't believe what was happening. The people out in a remote area of Japan called Shimane argued that some islands, basically not much more than rocks, in the middle of the sea between Korea and Japan, belonged to Japan. The islands have been under South Korean control since the 1950s. But these people in Shimane said those islands, which they call Takashima, are part of Shimane Prefecture's land, and they should be returned to Japan. The Japanese government responded to this and began to put pressure on Korea over these islands. Korea, of course, said, nonsense. These islands have always been part of Korea, not part of Japan. We're not going to give them back. And so in this year of friendship between Korea and Japan, things begin to deteriorate very rapidly. And the Japanese Prime Minister at that time, Koizumi, began to make visits to the Yasukuni Shrine in Tokyo. The Yasukuni Shrine is a place that houses the remains of the Japanese war dead. And there in that shrine are the remains of a fairly large number of people who were convicted as war criminals during World War II. So the Koreans, and for that matter the Chinese, view Japanese Prime Minister's visits to the Yasukuni Shrine as evidence of two things. One, that Japan did not truly repent for what it had done during World War II, and two, that Japanese are becoming more nationalistic and more militaristic. And these fears that Koreans have about nationalism and militarism have only increased under the current Japanese government, that of Abe, Prime Minister Abe, who has been very outspoken on his desire to amend the Japanese constitution to allow Japan to have regular military force. And underlying all of this are fears that if push comes to shove, the United States will favor Japan over Korea. Well, the United States did that in 1895. What's to keep them from doing it again? So Japan remains a very important factor in what happens in Northeast Asia. The third variable is Russia. After the collapse of the Soviet Union, the Russians pretty much turned in on themselves and didn't pay a whole lot of attention to their Far East, that is the maritime provinces on the Pacific shore. But in recent years, Russia has begun to invest heavily in that area, to attempt to develop the economy and to establish a stronger presence for themselves in Asia. Now, after the Ukraine crisis broke out, Russia has seen its relations with the United States and European countries deteriorate, and is now choosing to draw closer to China. So people begin to talk about, if not an alliance, at least a kind of partnership between China and Russia over economic and diplomatic military issues. So what this does is it once again makes us think about this question of the confrontation between continental and maritime powers. The continental powers being China and Russia, the maritime powers being the United States and Japan. And where is Korea? Korea is caught in the middle between the continental and the maritime powers. North Korea, we could say, is under the sway of the maritime powers, and South Korea is under the sway. North Korea is under the sway of the continental powers, Russia and China, and South Korea is under the sway of the maritime powers, the United States and Japan. The next variable is the United States. From the South Korean perspective, the United States is the linchpin of its diplomacy and its defense, its security. That is, for South Koreans, and particularly for South Korean conservatives, the United States is hugely important. The United States is also important economically for South Korea. I see South Korean-made cars on the streets everywhere. I see South Korean electronics in the stores and in my own house. So there's a great deal of trade between South Korea and the United States, but the United States is not as important economically to South Korea as it was before. As I mentioned a little bit earlier, the volume of trade between South Korea and China is considerably greater than the volume of trade between the United States and South Korea. But the bigger issue is how trustworthy is the United States? I think Koreans worry about this quite a bit. This is, in part, of course, related to the rise of skepticism or anti-U.S. sentiment from the 1980s. But it's more than that. South Koreans are aware that the United States in 1895 made a secret deal with Japan that resulted in the Japanese takeover of Korea. Of course, in 1950, the United States intervened and helped to defend Korea against communist aggression. In the 1960s, U.S. forces were still there. South Korea joined the United States in the war effort in Vietnam, in part because the South Koreans saw this as part of a united front against communist aggression. But then in the 1970s, there came the Nixon shock. What was the Nixon shock? So people usually talk about the Nixon shock in terms of taking the U.S. dollar off the gold standard, causing all these economic issues. But it was much more than that. Richard Nixon decided to open diplomatic relations with Communist China. So rulers of South Korea, they sit back saying, wait a minute, what's this? We're supposed to be anti-communist allies. So why are you making diplomatic relations with Communist China? Also, the early 1970s was when the United States decided to pull its forces out of Vietnam under the rubric of the Vietnamization of the war. From the South Korean perspective, what was happening was the United States was simply reneging on its commitments to South Vietnam and abandoning South Vietnam to Vietnamese communists. So South Korean leaders are saying, wait a minute. We depend everything on the United States for our defense, for our diplomacy. But look at what the United States is doing in China, and look at how it has abandoned Vietnam. Can we really trust the United States? And more recently, I think Koreans probably share the worries that lots of people have about the United States being in decline. That is, the United States still is the strongest military power in the world. It still has the world's largest economy. The United States has very serious domestic problems. The United States is being challenged by China as the world's top economy. So people are wondering, the United States begins to decline. The United States then turn away from its international commitments and adopt a more domestic-oriented approach. So there are concerns in Korea about how much Korea will be able to rely on the United States in the future. From the Chinese perspective, the United States is its main rival for hegemony. Not only economically, but particularly militarily and diplomatically in East Asia. China's economic relations with the United States are important, no question about it. But even here, Chinese economic relations with the United States are less important now than they were before because of the rapid growth of trade and investment within East Asia. And of course, Chinese worry about a unified Korea, a united Korea, under U.S. influence. That would mean the United States military forces could be right on China's border. And that must keep Chinese leaders awake at night, that prospect. Okay, I'm going to wrap up now with some final remarks. It's really difficult, I think, to predict whether South Korea will become closer to China or will remain close to the United States, because there are so many variables out there. I would venture that at least for now, for the short term, we'll probably see the maintenance of the sort of uneasy status quo. Over the long term, I think there are two important factors that we have to think about. One, will China continue to enjoy the kind of strong economic growth it's had over the last 20 years? Or will China begin to encounter some of the kinds of economic problems that other rapidly growing big developers have had? Will China's economy begin to slow down? On the other hand, the United States seems to be very much preoccupied, despite President Obama's announced pivot to Asia, with problems in the Middle East and to some extent in Europe. The U.S. public is extremely anxious over Islamic radicals in the Middle East and in Europe, and afraid of Islamic radicals in the United States. So will the United States be focusing on those problems and neglecting problems in East Asia, Northeast Asia? That, I don't know. But there's one other important factor that we have to keep in mind, and that is Korean nationalism. Will Koreans be willing to continue to accept U.S. hegemony? Lots of Koreans don't like it, but they have put up with it because they thought they really needed the United States to defend themselves against communist North Korea. On the other hand, will Koreans be willing to accept Chinese hegemony? Will they be willing to go back to the old pre-modern system? Or will Koreans find a third way? Many of my Korean friends talk about their ideal, which would be a unified and neutral Korea. I don't know if it's possible, but I too would like to see that happen. A Korea that could be truly independent, and not have to rely on either the United States or China.
Yeah, we will give certain time to our participants, to our attendees.
We have a little time for questions or comments, about 10 minutes. Do you have any questions or comments?
Good morning, Professor Duncan. I'm Korean ambassador in Guatemala. I enjoyed your presentation this morning, and I about how Koreans can see Korean questions from Koreans' perspective. I first of all thank the very interesting presentation, and also thank all the participants today to share Professor Duncan's I'm not going to get questions. I'm just making.
I'm sorry to interrupt, but I'm having a very difficult time hearing your question.
To appreciate your presentation. I'm really better than what did you hear me? Okay. As a Korean ambassador, I just want to make...
I'm afraid my audio is very poor here. I didn't hear your question.
Yes. First of all, I think your presentation to share your perspectives and
Please do.
knowledge about Korea on the history of Korea and the history relations, geopolitical relations with China and other neighboring countries, including US. This presentation serves as a very important moment for SIA, Centro de Investigaciones Artísticas of Rafael Landira University. This is the first event sponsored by Korea Foundation. And I'm sure that all the participants will feel so important that all the legitimate importance that Korea is important also I certainly want to make a very frequent comment that when I saw a map of Northeast Asia, the territorial similitude the space between Korean Peninsula and Japan was described as Sea of Japan, and Korean people are not agreeing with that description. So when you make a presentation directed to Korean people or some other Korean to any participants who have some understanding and the error, I would like to ask you to put some add the name together with Sea of Japan, like Sea of Japan or Sea of Korea, which have been used for centuries by only Korean people, but also many African countries in Europe and in other countries too. And still, the contemporary relations between the United States and Korea are not easy to simplify, but your perspectives are very important and very interesting, and especially the second half of U.S.-Korea relations, the second half of the 20th century was described as kind of period of tension when Korean people was seen as, according to your perspective, Korean people saw it just from a negative negative perspective like U.S. as a supporter of dictatorial regime and some listeners like the Bamboo and some other issues that I would like to remind the Korean people in the process of the second half of the 20th century, Korean people have seen Korea and seen the U.S. as a very important partner in our economic development and in our democratization process. So please, I also want to share this perspective of most Koreans that see the United States not only as supporter of U.S. Not supporter of military regime in Korea, but also have been more of a contributor to national economic development, and was also defense of South Korea against North Korean threat. I once again thank Professor Duncan for your very interesting presentation. Thank you.
Thank you. I was not able to understand much of what you said, but I do apologize for the map that shows Sea of Japan. This morning my regular computer crashed just as I was preparing for this talk. And so in my rush to find a map that showed East Asia, I was neglected to double check on the issue of naming of the East Sea. And I apologize for that. I'll try to make sure that doesn't happen in future presentations. Second, I think your point about partnership between Korea and the United States in democratization and the economy is well taken. Korea is now in the process of sort of, from my perspective, of creating for itself a role, a diplomatic role as a middle power. That is, it seeking to find ways in which it can exert influence throughout the world as a middle power, and a power that is aligned with the United States, but is not, necessarily walking lockstep with the United States on many different issues. And I think that's a very positive development, and I'm happy to see that. And for me, the biggest problem in that regard is the question of reunification. I am one person who, for various reasons, really hopes to see reunification in Korea sometime in the not-too-distant future. Whether that will happen or not, I don't know. But I think as long as Korea remains divided, that division will continue to complicate South Korea's position, because South Korea's ability to exert more influence throughout the world. I think it's now time for me to go. I have to go into school and deal with some things. But
yeah, Professor Duncan, we have another question.
We'll be happy to answer questions by email later on today, or perhaps on Friday, if you'll go ahead and send them in.
Okay. Do you want to ask the last question? Okay. It says, I understand you're not a political science, but I believe China would be.
I see the question here says,
Yeah, I understand the question.
just what says, I believe China would.
I believe China would favor and beautify Korea on results for its economic potential. I don't think China sees an unpredictable North Korea with good eyes. So what do you think, and what would be your solution?
I think that China would look favorably on a reunified Korea under Seoul if U.S. forces were no longer in Korea. But if reunification under Seoul means that U.S. forces will remain in Korea, then I think China would not be happy about that. So that's an issue that would have to be worked out.
¿Otra pregunta o comentario?
Yeah, I don't think China has a particularly high opinion of North Korea's leadership. Okay, it is time for me to go now. But thank you for your attention, and I hope that you were able to follow my presentation easily. I tried to use PowerPoint to make an outline, to make it simpler for you, so you didn't get any interesting photographs, just a lot of words. Okay. Thank you very much. Muchas gracias.
Thank you, Dr. Duncan, for your presentation.
Okay.
Bueno, hemos concluido lo que es la conferencia de China versus United States, Influence over South Korea, y agradecemos en nombre del Centro de Investigaciones Asia-Pacífico, pues a todos ustedes por su presencia, por su colaboración y por estar interesados en lo que son los estudios coreanos. Próximamente vamos a estar realizando más actividades, siempre con el auspicio de Korea Foundation. Por lo tanto, les agradecemos mucho tanto a la Embajada de Corea porque ellos nos han apoyado mucho.